called Lady Slipper. The first orchid was a Paphiopelium, native to southern China, India, Southeast Asia, and the Pacific Islands. It is commonly known as a lady slipper orchid, but the flower looked more like a rosy-throated pelican, beak open, spotted wings spread wide. The lady slipper has an extremely long life cycle and will only flower under very specific circumstances. Gran gave it to my mother on January 6, 1986, the day he sped from Daly City to Mountain View, California, and at 74, skipped down the halls of the maternity ward of El Camino Hospital to see his first great-granddaughter. The second orchid was a cymbidium, with small yellow and brown flowers like a cluster of finches nestled, peeking out between the thin spikes like tall grass. The cymbidium is unique among orchids because it can survive at near-freezing temperatures, and it can bloom in winter. Gran gave it to my parents in March of 1989, when they bought our home in Sunnyvale shortly before my brother was born. The real estate agent showed them the dimly lit house one evening after dark, casually mentioning that the schools were great here, that the yard was big enough to build a pool, that another couple had made an offer. My dad said no. He said, we can't rush this. But the real estate agent showed them the fireplace, the 2.5 bathrooms, the extra bedrooms, and my mother almost pleaded. The market was going up and her belly was growing, so they topped the other offer and still managed to pay under $400K. For the area, the price was modest. But on move-in day, they noticed the shag carpeting, the yellow linoleum, the wood paneling on the lower half of the living room walls. The chimney was too short to have a fire without smoke billowing into the house. In the yard, there were bricks, broken pots, an old aquarium. My father put on gloves and shoved it all into a trash can, cursing. At 32, his hair was already gray. This is what happens when you hurry into things, he told my mother. This was before the dot-com bubble, before almost every home in America had a personal computer. The World Wide Web was about to be invented, but for now, there were cymbidiums. My mother planted all of them in pretty pots in the backyard until the new puppy, Magic, made toys of them. She would pick them up by the leaves and tear up and down the yard, swinging them around until the pots broke. The orchids survived. Circa 1996, the trees started to die. The cherry tree I liked to climb as a child went first. It was split rotten from the roots to the first set of branches. Next, the redwood died, and I remember missing its fresh rain smell in the morning. It was some kind of infestation, a fungus or bark beetle, something in the ground that was causing the trees to die in waves all over the valley. My mother went to work for JDS Uniphase, a fast-growing tech firm, and my dad got a job as a programmer at Hewlett-Packard. The puppy had grown up. My brother and I were both in Catholic school. I started playing basketball, and when he had time, I played pickup games in the street with my dad. Sometimes I won. When I did, his eyes went wide, and he laughed in short barks, and I knew I hadn't won just because he let me. When I won, he always challenged me to another game. At school, cell phones were still things that rich people had, but more and more people had them. Mother sat in the school parking lot in the Lincoln Navigators they couldn't drive, and talked on their analog bricks about giving to the church, about community service. My mother laughed when the people across the street put their house on the market and asked for just under $1 million. We were all shocked when the Indian family that eventually moved in paid $1.2 million. It was then that my mother bought herself the first Phalaenopsis, a moth orchid. The moth orchid grows large, colorful blossoms with very little care, and they are easy to crossbreed. With so many different colors available, my mother had to have more orchids. She had moth orchids in white and in purple, orchids with spots, orchids with vein lines. She cut the spikes just above the joints to encourage them to flower as much as possible. She fed them weekly, crammed into the kitchen sink. There was no way to get a glass under the faucet. The wet bark almost smelled like the redwood tree used to, except for the ammonia smell of the fertilizer. The moth orchids survived the kitchen remodel. They survived all the neighbors and friends and relatives who bumped them while oohing and awing over the new Corian countertops, the oak cabinets, and look at all this light. The neighbors planned their own kitchen remodels. In the San Jose Mercury News, there was an advertisement. Do you love orchids but don't have time to care for them? If so, our orchid leasing plan is perfect for you. We will deliver fresh, perfectly blooming orchids every week, and you won't even have to water them. Prices start at just $15 per plant per week, including delivery. Moth orchids started showing up in restaurants and banks, in the lobbies of exploding Silicon Valley startups. They crowded into our new kitchen from the new garden window, shaded by the remaining pine tree in the backyard. Then the tree died. The orchids started to curl and yellow, but my mother caught it in time, put up a shade cloth to protect them, and they recovered. She would have noticed earlier that the orchids were in trouble, but it was October of 1999, and over the next few months, the Federal Reserve increased interest rates 6 times. The talk around the house was all about the massive upturn in the stock market. My mother wanted to sell some of her JDSU employee options. "This won't last forever," she said from the kitchen sink. The linoleum was only a few years old, but it was already starting to look tired. "We need to think about college tuition." My dad rolled his eyes, as had become customary whenever my mother had anything to say about money, cars, or sprained ankles. "If this keeps up, he said, we can afford to retire early and send both kids to Stanford." "Maybe I can play basketball for Stanford," I said. "If I practice a lot and study harder next year in high school, maybe I can get a scholarship." "You don't have what it takes," my dad said. He left the room, and my mom stood at the kitchen sink, scrubbing dishes. She studied the orchids in the window, but maybe he was right. I tried out for the junior high basketball team that winter and got cut. The next orchid didn't come until a year later, after the dot-com bubble burst in March of 2000. A few of the girls at school still boasted their $800 8th grade graduation dresses. A handful of kids continued to arrive at school in BMW Z3s with dealer plates. But some kids finished out the year before they quietly switched to public school. A few moved out of 5-bedroom houses in Los Altos Hills and started living in rental homes. My parents managed to keep up with our tuition, but my mom put it this way. Before the dot-com crash, they could have sent my brother and me to any university we wanted. Now, she said, it looks like you'll be working at McDonald's. My dad rolled his eyes. "Don't be judgmental. This is a new kind of market. It will stabilize." My mom chewed the inside of her cheek and said nothing. My mom started losing weight fast, so she started seeing a shrink who prescribed Xanax, but it didn't seem to do any good. She hit 102 pounds the day she told me in August of 2000 that if things didn't get better soon, she'd have to leave. She said if she left, she wouldn't go far, but when I asked her to take me with her, she said no. The next orchid was given to my mother by my father, just after Christmas of 2000, after he went into debt to buy my mom diamonds and DVD players. It was a red spotted cattleya, native to Costa Rica and South America. Cattleyas are known for their large, showy flowers. They are expensive, and if neglected, they die quickly. My dad moved out 2 weeks later. When they sat us down on the couch and told us, my brother, who was now 11, started to cry. My dad quickly tried to tell us that it would be fun because his new apartment had a working fireplace and a pool, and we could have our friends over and make s'mores. He told us everything would be okay, that it was just for a while. My brother stopped crying. I stared at the ceiling. There were 3 more orchids after that, and they were all purple moth orchids, all with grocery store price tags on the cheap plastic pots, all left on the porch, all left anonymously. But we knew who they were from. On the morning an orchid showed up, my dad would pick us up to take us to school, and his eyes would be red. He would punch buttons on the radio and ask, "Did your mom get a present this morning?" And we would say we didn't know and squirm in our seats. My mom, my brother, and I were living on hamburger helper, oatmeal, chicken, and rice. We didn't buy new clothes, and we didn't go to the movies. Gran helped out when my mom's car needed a new transmission, or when the tires were bald. But they were still orchids, because while my mother's assets had been in both of their names, my father's were in his name only. There was an orchid for Valentine's Day, one for Mother's Day, and on my mom's birthday, there was one pathetic moth orchid looking up at us from the doormat. I secretly remember September 11th, 2001, as the day there was no orchid. Most people remember it for one reason. A few people might remember it as the day the New York Stock Exchange closed for 4 days and sealed the fate of the dot-coms. For me, it would have been my parents' 18th wedding anniversary. But there was no anniversary, and there were no more orchids. That winter, a storm blew away the shade cloth that protected the garden window. Over the next few months, as the sun shifted to summer exposure, the orchids scorched. This time, my mother threw them away. Only the cymbidiums and that first lady's liver orchid survived. Thank you.